Fire Emblem 8, also known as Fire Emblem the Sacred Stones, is generally referred to as the easiest of the 3 GBA titles for Fire Emblem. With this information in mind, I decided to jump along the path of doing a 0% growth run, something I've never actually tackled before. Fire Emblem 8 has always been near and dear to my heart, so I decided to give it a shot doing 0% growths. Now going into this, I expect our early game to be nice and easy, and then it'll get progressively harder as we go on, considering we're limited on what stats we have on our units. So before we jump in, let's just go over a few of the rules real quick. And when I say a few of the rules, I mean there's hardly any. The only rule, of course, is there are no stat gains on any unit. Besides that, it's pretty much free game. You can do whatever you want in the challenge. With that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into the challenge of, can you beat Fire Emblem the Sacred Stones with only bases and 0% growths? Now, let's just preface this off by sort of pointing out the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is, of course, Seth. Now, Seth is notorious for being one of the most broken Jagan type characters in the entire franchise. Now, if you don't know what a Jagan type character is, it's an early game unit that's promoted that helps your lords out in the beginning and quickly falls off soon after. Seth, on the other hand, has just enough stats that carries him through the game without even getting any growths. With that sort of knowledge in mind, we're pretty much able to clear the prologue, chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3 instantly with Seth. At least the good thing is, with starting with chapter 2, we do get a little bit of scaling from our other units. On chapter 2, we get Garcia, who ends up being a decent help. Well, we get Ross too, but Ross is really irrelevant in this run. Trainee units are useless because they can't grow, and that's the whole point of them, so we just don't even bother with them. And also on chapter 3, we were able to pick up Colm, who will be useful not for combat, but for picking up treasure. Pretty much every single fight here is a Seth slugfest, with the occasional Vanessa, Gilliam, and Garcia helping out. Mulder also ends up being a nice little addition to our team in these few chapters because he has decent enough healing. It's base 4 magic, but it's decent enough that we're able to top up Seth when we need to. And in case Vanessa or Gilliam or Garcia get hit, we can heal them up. So Mulder's there for a nice backup plan, essentially. Chapter 4 is when we move away from the Seth dialogue a little, and we get access to Artur. Now, Artur ended up being a little bit more surprising than I thought he was going to be. He was able to double a lot of the monsters in this chapter, and of course light magic is good against monster units. So he ends up being a nice little backup plan to our other units. By this stage, it's very early. The only two I keep using is Gilliam and Garcia, mainly because Gilliam has the defense and Garcia is still strong enough to be able to do a decent amount of damage. The best thing that Artur has going for him is he has a really good hit rate, so I don't have to worry about the tragedy I have with Garcia, which is missing a lot. We're able to clear chapter 4, head on to chapter 5, which we get access to possibly one of the better characters in this run. And no, I'm not talking about Natasha before you say it. Natasha is god-awful, and we all know that. No, it's our boy Joshua. Joshua is an excellent unit. He has a decent attack stat, with it being 8, but his skill and speed are at least 13 on both sides. Joshua's attack isn't insane, but that's typical for a Myrmidon. He's got really good skill and speed though, so we are able to pretty much dodge tank everything that we need to if we put him on a forest tile, and he does a good enough damage and he's able to double everything. He makes up for a great counterpart to Seth, because we can't just expect Seth to kill everything on the maps. As we're going up and up each chapter, there's more and more enemies, and then this chapter is a village chapter, and we have sort of multiple paths that we need to go. So it's a lot easier when we have multiple units that can do some damage. If it's not a lot, at least it'll give time for Seth to sort of come in and steal the day. Next we move on to chapter 5X, which is interestingly our only Gaiden chapter in this entire game, which is weird to think because on our last challenge run, when I did Binding Blade, there was almost a Gaiden chapter every other chapter, which was insane. But this chapter you've just got Kyle, Ford, Ephraim, and Orson. In this chapter, Orson is sort of our Seth. He just one-shots everything. So 5x is pretty easy. Now, chapter 6. Ooh, chapter 6. Okay, chapter 6 is not terrible, but it's the beginning of sort of more annoying situations where I've had to reset. This is the first time in the game where I have to reset, and it's mainly for BS reasons. So, as you can see here, we've got our first Fog of War map. And the thing that sucks about Fog of War maps, unless you memorize the enemy's locations, is you've got no idea where anything is. So you've sort of got to go into it blind. And so what I did in this chapter was I had everyone else go on the right side and I put Seth up north. So I basically left it to a group effort of everyone chipping away at the enemies. So it's pretty much just Joshua and Arthur doing most of the work. And Seth just clears up the north like nobody's business. The best thing about this is it's a defeat boss chapter, and I'm so used to, when I'm playing Fire Emblem, to killing every enemy because I want to get as much experience as possible. And here it literally doesn't matter. I mean, it does kind of matter because you want to be able to get to level 10 in order to promote, so you can get your promotion gains, because those promotion gains and stat boosting items are the only two things. Talking about stat boosting items, the early game things that we get are like the Draco Shield, you get a skill book, you get an angelic robe. Pretty much, I don't use the skill book quite early enough, but I give everything else to Seth just because I'm like, alright, we gotta make this boy beefy. After dying a few times and having to reset, it at least helped me gather the intel on the enemy's location, and now I realize, oh, I shouldn't put my units there, so I'll just hide out, and sort of I took the slow route, waited for Seth to get there, and then just finished the chapter the slow and steady way. Now, chapter 7 wasn't bad either. It was terrifying for all the wrong reasons though. Now our enemies are getting stronger and stronger, and it's getting harder for any other unit besides from Seth to really do damage. I'm still able to pick off a few units with France and all the other weaker units that I have in my army, but I really got to be careful about where I'm placing everyone. The biggest threat to me this chapter actually wasn't the boss at all. It was the ballistas. Thank God I got super lucky on my first playthrough of this, and I dodged the ballista shots that went on Vanessa. Like, it does to me. I'm the type of guy that I have to keep most of my units alive. If someone dies, I reset. I know in this challenge it's like, all right, Vanessa's gonna be useless pretty much after this chapter or in a few chapters, so we're just not gonna use her at all. In this run, it's a little bit different, but I still don't feel like sacrificing off units unless I absolutely have to, so I'd rather reset. It's just instilled in my mind, I guess. Anyway, the boss this time, Murray, actually gets taken down by Joshua with a nice crit. And we move on to chapter 8. These early chapters really do feel just the same to me, because again, my strategy in this chapter is the same thing I've been doing this entire time. It's just I lead my army with Seth, leave him to take damage on enemy turns, follow up attacks with Joshua, Garcia, and whoever else I have at the time. But at least in this chapter, we get access to Ephraim, Kyle, and Ford. Now, let me sort of explain about Kyle and Ford. Kyle and Ford are great in this challenge because they've got decent stats and they're around promotion level. Their stats are around the 9 to 10 range on each, with Kyle being more defensive and Ford being more offensive. So Kyle makes for a good Great Knight and Ford makes for a good Paladin. While their stats aren't amazing, they're good replacements at this point for France and Gilliam, so we can finally get those two off our team. And Ephraim isn't amazing, but he has the Reagan Leaf, which is a very, very good lance at this point, so he's able to deal quite a bit of damage to each enemy, so I feel comfortable leaving him on his own. This chapter is, I believe, the first chapter that we run into a promoted unit, which is Tirado. Tirado is a promoted general, and it's a little bit of a team effort to defeat him, but Joshua is able to cinch it with the armor slayer I gave him. So chapter 9 is the beginning of the route split, so you can either pick the Erica path or the Ephraim path. I went for the Erica path because it's slightly easier, and I'm like, I don't want to, mess around too much. And plus, I wanted to get access to certain units earlier, so that was my main reason. But anyway, chapter 9. Now, I was terrified going into this because a lot of people told me chapter 9 was awful, but I didn't have too much of a problem with it. We get Tana, who, again, doesn't have amazing strength, as a Pegasus Knight usually doesn't, but she's got 13 speed, which is pretty good for this point. So getting her up to level 10 was my priority here, to try and make her into a Falcon Knight. But anyway, now with Tana, Kyle, and Ford on our team, I'm able to afford to sort of take things a little bit easier. Seth isn't gonna have to tank every single hit. Now, this chapter, Amelia joins you, but we kill her. I actually did try to recruit her, but she suicided into my units and Erica was way too far behind, so I'm just like, screw it, we don't need her at all. I was like thinking, do I need her to recruit anyone else? And no, I didn't, so she died, which is fine. Goddammit, Amelia. The other thing I wasn't able to do in this chapter was secure the southern house. I mean, there is a strategy to do that, but I just didn't feel comfortable enough leaving a few of my units around to chase after the pirates, and I didn't really want Tana to suicide in there herself, so I'm like, I didn't really need the item that was in there, so I was just like, alright, let's just play through this again, slow and steady. No point in rushing this if we're just gonna get screwed over. I will admit also that Tana is pretty nice in this chapter, because there's a few mages that we run into, and Pegasus Knights are pretty notorious for having really good resistance, so I'm able to deal with the mages a little bit easier. This is a huge map, but the majority of my good units are all on horseback, so navigating the map wasn't that big of a problem. We stock up on supplies, head towards the boss. Now, our boss here is Binks, who gave us quite a bit of trouble. Now, Binks is a very defensive boss. He's a warrior. Not the best resistance in the world, but he's got really high defense. I can do damage, but it's pretty much only Seth that can do damage. So even with Archer, who's still decent enough to use, but not an amazing unit by any stretch of the imagination, Seth is again our carry here. After that, we head on to chapter 10, which is probably my favorite chapter in this specific run. Why? Because Garrick. In this chapter, we get access to 4 new units. Marissa, who is nice because she has a Shamshir, but that's it. Just she's only useful for her Shamshir. And then we've got Tethys, our dancer, who is indispensable. Regardless of whether you're doing 0% growth run or whatever, a dancer still can dance. And it means that I can use Seth twice in a turn, which is insane because Seth is still godlike. I knew Seth was broken, but this run just solidified that. And I'm like, oh my lord, Seth, you are a broken ass unit. Yeah, I don't want to bore you guys with me saying all the time that Seth is like the best unit in the game, but it's pretty bad how just insane he is. Like, if you compare him to Titania, who's the next best Jagan character, it's still like, at least Titania falls off a little, and Ike shines in FE9. But this, no, Seth just destroys Erica in every means. But anyway, the next 2 units after Tethys are Innis and Garrick. Oh boy. Okay, so let me talk about Innis first. Innis is going to be our only arch that we use because Naomi is useless. He has pretty much 13, 14, and 14 for his 3 stats: strength, speed, skill, and speed, the most important stats. So he's able to pretty much double everything because Joshua is around the same speed and Joshua is still doubling everything. And he's got a silver bow, so he does an insane amount of damage. It's just, Innis is really good. You get a real appreciation when you're doing a run like this of just the characters that you're like, oh yeah, pre-promoted units. Like, because in a vanilla run, most people just don't use pre-promoted units because they just fall off compared to units that you level up over time. But anyway, enough about Innis. The main guy here is Garrick. Now, Garrick starts off as a level 10 mercenary who has a hero crest on him, so you can insta promote him. And I highly recommend you promote him into a hero. Not only is hero, I'd honestly say, in my personal opinion, hero is the best class in this game because it has access to swords and axes. Sure, it doesn't have lances, but there's a lot of enemies with axes in this game, a lot of monsters, a lot of humans, whatever, and axes just give that range that it needs, a sword class needs. So heroes are insane. And plus, Garrick with the promotion has base 15 attack, 15 strength. That is insane. That is actually just insane. His other stats are pretty darn good too, considering he's got 15 skill and 15 speed also. God, he's just so good in this run. I'd never used Garrick before. Well, I mean, I have, but like I've never used him to this extent. So Garrick and Innis basically make it so it's not a Seth only run anymore. Sure, we had characters like Joshua who were helping, but Joshua was more like a boss killer, not really a stand out and attack everything. Innis and Garrick are able to hold their own, and with Tethys' help to basically give another unit the chance to dance, we're set. We are completely set. So we are able to clear through chapter 10 without any trouble at all. Chapter 11 is another Fog of War map. And thankfully, unlike the last one, this one wasn't too bad. Considering now we have Seth and we have our other two OP units, Innes and Garrick. And also, may I mention that this is a monster only map. So even though Archer has really fallen off by this point, he's still able to put in a nice bit of accurate chip damage, doing 9 to 10 damage each turn, and he's not even promoted. We bring Colm along to grab all the treasure chests, and on this chapter we recruit 2 new units, Larashel and Dozla. Let's go over Larashel first. Larashel is a good healer. I should say she's a decent healer. She's got 2 more base magic than Mulder does, but the biggest thing for me is she's on horseback. Now, regardless of your opinion on Larashel as a unit, any unit that's on horseback is a good unit in my book. She ends up replacing Mulder as my healer. Now, even though I honestly, in hindsight, I probably shouldn't have done this because Mulder was getting close to A rank in staves. I probably should have left that up to him, but I got greedy, I guess, and I switched over to Larashel permanently. Now, the other unit we got here is Dozla, and Dozla is one of those unfortunate units that's not that good, but we have to bring him along anyway. The reason Dozla is good is he's a pre-promoted unit. He's got 16 strength, so he's our strongest unit right now. The bad things about him, though, is he's got 9 speed, which comparatively to all of our other OP units is nothing, and he'll be able to get doubled a lot. At least he does have that base crit damage that he gets for being a berserker. So in a vanilla run, I would never use Dozla under any conditions, but in this run, Dozla is a necessary evil, I would say. The rest of this chapter goes by pretty smoothly, and we move on to the next one. Chapter 12. Ooh, these 3 chapters have been a blessing. Now, this is both a really good chapter and a really, really, really bad one. Now, this is the first chapter I would consider where there's a spike in difficulty. It's a monster-only chapter yet again, but there are a lot of spiders, which are insanely strong. They only have 1 move in the mountains, but they are really, really powerful, and only our broke units can deal with them. And there's also gargoyles, which can fly, and other units that are just slightly annoying, even bringing in the gorgons. And this chapter is very, very funnily. That's not a word, but what I mean by that is you have to funnel all of your units into one tight corridor unless they're flying. And our only flying unit that we're using right now is Tana. So we have to funnel everyone into one little corridor. And I don't like maps like that. However, this chapter, we get Sayla. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but I'm gonna go with that. Sayla is, ooh, God, oh, okay. Yeah, we've beaten Seth. Seth at this point is starting to fall off. I know, it sounds weird, right? Seth, best unit in the game, starting to fall off? No, you're lying. But no, he is starting to fall off now. Having 12 to 13 stats isn't that great anymore. But Sayla, on the other hand, ooh, my lord. He has 16 base magic, 18 base skill, and 14 speed. So at this point, he's pretty much able to one-shot anything we run into. So Sayla has easily become our new Seth, and it's great. It's a liberating feeling not having to rely on one unit constantly. But anyway, we are able to clear chapter 12 without much of an issue, really. It's great. Next on we move on to chapter 13, which is the defense chapter, one of only 2 in the game. Now the objective of this chapter is to defeat the boss Ias, and if you defeat him before the 11 turns are up, you just end the chapter that way. So that's what you'd think we would do, but my dumbass thought that I would be able to get a body ring that shows up on turn 9, and then realized I'd have to steal it, and I don't have any units that could steal anything. Because the unfortunate thing also about this run is Colm has no way of leveling up his stats, so he can't steal stuff. So me getting stealing items is kind of gonna be impossible. However, the chapter in itself is completely easy. Again, Sayla is able to do a crap ton of damage, and he still has enough speed to double most enemies. And we were able to just surround the boss pretty easily with all of our strong units. Make sure you stay at least until turn 5 though, because you'll get access to Cormag, who shows up. Now you're going to recruit Cormag with Erica, and Cormag is another one of those Dozla type characters, who's not bad, but he's not great either. He's got decent attack, starting out at 14, but he's only got 10 speed. So he's more of a defensive type character because he's a Wyvern Rider. That's nice at least, because we don't really have any defensive walls besides from Dozla and I guess maybe Garrick and Seth. I mean, everyone's more of a defensive wall in this run, but No, the later and later we go into it, the worse and worse each unit's going to get. So at least having a semi-decent unit to replace one of our crappy units is what we need in this run. After getting Cormag and messing around for a few more turns, we beat up Ias, get a Knight's Crest, which is pretty nice, and we move on to the next chapter. Chapter 14 is probably the most annoying chapter I've run into, not for difficulty reasons, but the sheer amount of time it took me to beat. Okay, so let me sort of explain why this was so annoying for me. So, reason number one was Renek. Renek is a rogue who we are going to be able to recruit in this chapter, but you need to recruit him. You have two options for recruiting him. Either Erica, who you pay 9,000 gold for, 9,800, or Larishel, which is free. So, of course, we want to go with Larishel, right? I split up my party and try and cut off Renek at the north, but there's a lot of enemy reinforcements in this chapter, and it just becomes sort of a slug for me to get up to where Renek is hiding. So it took several attempts for me to do it, but eventually I was able to recruit Renek. The most annoying thing, though, was there was a Berserk staff user right next to Renek. So anytime I try to get a unit close, I'd just get Berserked. So I'd have to move all my units away, wait for the Berserk to end, and go back and try again. And it took way too many turns to do that. And as I said earlier, there's a lot of enemy reinforcements this chapter. However, it's pretty nice that we have Cormag now, who's really, really defensive. So all of the reinforcements that come from the south, I just leave Cormag to deal with Garrick helping a little bit. But the rest of the units, I sort of have to spread out all of my guys and hope for the best, essentially. After about, this took me about 45 minutes to do, which is the longest chapter so far, which is weird because on my last run, the Biting Blade one, took me about an hour per chapter. So at least this one's going by a lot quicker. However, it was still ungodly amounts of annoying. There's also, when you get Renek, you get access to the member card. And the member shop is on the left side of the map near the throne room. And there's things like killer lances, killer axes, killer bows, whatever, all your killer weapons. Also, if you need them, you have promotion items. But we don't really need them anymore because we don't really have anything else to promote that we want to. After godly amounts of time, Sayla is able to take out Carlisle, and we move on to yet another pain in the ass chapter. Chapter 15 is thankfully the only desert chapter that we have in this. Now this is a really, really annoying chapter, right? There are a lot of reinforcements, and a lot of them are relatively scary. And we still have to carry around units like Erica and Tethys while trying to avoid them dying. So we have to play the protect game this chapter, essentially. Also in this chapter, Ephraim and his squad of Dwessel and Noel join. Ephraim I don't actually end up using very much, but I use Noel more than I thought I would. Dwessel's pretty decent because he's very, very, very beefy, and he's got a nice 17 attack. Dwessel's not bad, but Noel is a unit I just didn't expect I'd use. The only reason I ended up using him because he's got 12 magic and not a lot of speed. It's very average for this point. It's like Seth levels of speed and stuff. But having that dark magic user is very nice. It's just good to have it on the background. And I wanted to eventually get him to use the Gleipnir tome towards endgame, just in case I needed any extra help fighting against Formortis. Now what you want to do is make sure you bring at least, for in my case, Renek along, because there are items scattered throughout the map. And if you have a Thief, the Thief will be able to pick up the items instantly. But if you have any on-foot unit or mounted unit, as long as it's not flying, you have a 1 in 9 chance of picking up that item. There are two bosses on this chapter, Kalek and Volter. Kalek was probably the more annoying boss, which is kind of weird. Kalek spawns on the top left, sort of near to your army. I had to use a combination of Innis, Sayla, and Garrick to take him down, because he was just really strong. Volter was a lot easier though, thank God. He did have a Feli shield, which essentially prevents damage from bows, but he didn't give me too much problem, and I was able to smack him in the face with Dwessel. Thank God this is the only desert chapter, because limited movement and a crap ton of enemy reinforcements made this chapter take me an hour and a half. It was awful. Chapter 16 is our attempt to retake a castle, and this goes swimmingly well. Compared to the last chapter, I loved going through this chapter. While it did take me about 50 minutes, it wasn't that difficult, it was just time consuming. The biggest problem I did have was there is a purge user and a bolting user near the throne, so I had to keep all of my really, really weak units like Larishel, Erica and Tethys towards the back, and there were a lot of heroes protecting them, so I had a hard time. I had to reset a couple of times just to sort of get A, good RNG, and B, good RNG. But after that, the boss Orson wasn't too big of a deal. Now at the end of this chapter, both Erica and Ephraim promote into Great Lords, which really doesn't affect our run much because I'm not using them anyway. Chapter 17 is where we get access to our last unit, Cyrene. Oh, and I also forgot to mention we do get access to Mir, who I'll be talking about later because we don't use Mir right now. Chapter 17 was a very, very simple chapter yet again. Thankfully, this challenge has been not nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be. It gets worse, trust me, but it wasn't. This chapter was pretty easy. Cyrene actually ended up being better than I thought. While she didn't have the best stats, being like 12 attack and 14 speed, she had pretty good weapons to make up for it with a silver lance and a javelin. So she was able to pick off a lot of the druids because, you know, resistance. And we sort of just went through the chapter like normal. I had Seth, Cormag, and Garrick deal with the left reinforcements, and everyone else sort of funneled into the right. Leon was a bit of a challenge to beat with his Fenrir, but Dwessel was able to get the last hit and finish the chapter. We're getting more and more legendary weapons now, but we aren't going to use them quite yet. Next up we have chapter 18, which is it's always been known as a breeze. The most annoying part of this chapter are the Gorgons scattered throughout, which I do actually have to reset twice because I keep forgetting that Cormag has absolutely cheeks resistance, like awful resistance. So I kept getting stoned in one shot. However, after a couple of attempts, I'm able to get through chapter 18 pretty easily. It's a good chapter if you need to grind up any units, but of course we don't need to in this run. All of the eggs give about 50 experience, which is insane at this point in the game. The main gimmick of the chapter is just to destroy the eggs before any gargoyles hatch. If you do that, there's hardly any enemies to deal with. Oh god, next on, we move on to chapter 19, and jeez, okay. This chapter was terrifying. This is like the first really, really, really difficult challenge, or really, really difficult chapter, I should say. It's a defense chapter in which you have to protect the king for 13 turns, and there are multiple entrances in which enemies can come from. So my strategy for this was I left Dozla and Garrick in the north passage. I had Tethys and Larashel behind them for healing. On my right flank, I used Seth and Joshua to help deal with that area, as there weren't many enemies and Seth was pretty mobile. Joshua was already over there, and Joshua's pretty weak by this point, even though he's a sword master. The left path, which was the strongest, where the strongest enemies were and the most enemies were, was where I sent pretty much the rest of my army, which included units like Sayla, Dwessel, Archer, Renak, Ephraim, and Innis. This is a chapter where you have access to 18 units, or 17 or 18 units, one of the two. So you've got a big pull of units to use. But in our run, that's kind of bad because we don't really have any good units anymore. And the good units that we have are very, very limited in number. Also, it doesn't help that this chapter is Fog of War, so I reset a lot during this. Because situations like in the north, I probably shouldn't have sent Dozla up there because there were pretty much only heroes. There are heroes, warriors, and snipers. Dozla's not the greatest, especially as I forgot to give him a hand axe. So that was kind of a struggle up there, and that wasn't even the worst of it. The worst part, to be honest, was down south on the left side. I had to wall off the enemies with 2 units, and the only 2 units strong enough down there were Dwessel and Sayla. Now, Sayla is really, really strong, but he has hardly any defense. So my strategy for this little area was I had to kill every single unit in one turn. Because if I left it to live a second turn, what would happen? An enemy would attack me, I would kill it. So my strategy down here on the south side was essentially I had to make sure every single enemy unit lived each turn. On my turn, I would kill off any weak ones, and on their turn, they would do damage to me. So that meant, because of how the AI targeting works in this game and how bad it is, they sort of all of the enemies just funnel into one area, and all the ranged enemies were in the back. So I didn't have to worry about being hit multiple times. I just had to worry about getting hit once. So if Sayla could live one attack, I would be okay. So that was my strategy, is to just make sure everything dies on my turn, and then make sure they live on when it's the enemy's turn. So thankfully Dwessel hardly took any damage because Dwessel's just super tanky. But Sailor almost died a lot of times, and sometimes he did die, and I just had to reset, and it was awful. I didn't go after killing Reeve, because that was just not worth it for me, getting Aura. But with enough resets and enough patience, I guess you could say, I was able to clear the chapter. Also, I did only get the treasure chest on the on the left-hand side. One, because I didn't have enough turns to get both, and I didn't bring Colm along. And two, I just decided to get the left ones because they had better treasure. But thank God that mess of a chapter is done, and we can move on to the penultimate chapter, 20. Now, compared to chapter 19, chapter 20 goes a little bit better. I only say a little bit because it's still kind of a struggle. Now, this is another monster-only chapter, and there are an insane amount of really strong enemies. You've got Cyclopses, you've got floating eyes, you've got centaurs, you've got gorgons, you've got death goyles, you've got skeleton archers, you've got all of these advanced monsters, and I think the Cyclopses were the scariest ones. So thank God there's a lot of forest tiles. I essentially had to play the pussy game of slowly advancing with Garrick and Dwessel using my more defensive units. But actually this chapter is kind of cool because it was the only chapter that I used Mir in, and Mir actually put in some damn good work. Now, Mir is essentially a unit that you can only use 50 times. She starts off at level 1 with like no stats, but her stats get boosted by plus 20, I believe, to each stat with a Divine Stone. So she ends up being pretty damn good, but only until the Divine Stone goes away. So I ended up using Mir to sort of clear up the reinforcements, along with like Cyrene and my other flyers. Moved Noel and the rest of the squad down south. And I ended up doing a lot of Nos tanker with Noel, more than I thought I would, to be honest. But now is the proper fight against Reeve. I had to get pretty lucky with the Reeve fight to A, not take too much damage, and B, be able to kill him in one turn, because if I left it up for 2 turns, I would be screwed. Thankfully, at least though, Innes took care of Reeve for me, and it was just the zombie dragon I had to deal with. The zombie dragon was pretty scary. It ended up doing at least, I believe it was 36 damage to any of my units that were in the way. So what I had to do is I had to grab a unit that had more than 36 health, so in this case I used Dwessel. I took out the legendary spear, the Vidolfnir, I guess you can pronounce it, in order to do a bit more damage to the undead dragon Morva, who I believe is Mir's dad. But anyway, I was able to do a little bit of damage, and then I actually... God, I'm an awful person. I didn't realize this. But with exactly 39 HP left, I was able to kill Morva with Mir. So yay, a daughter killing a father. Patricide, yay! And now, we move on to this ungodly chapter. Alright, we're on the last chapter, guys. We're in the home stretch. We're almost there. This chapter, comparatively, not that bad. Surprisingly. Well, I should say the first half wasn't that bad. I'll get to that in a second. So all we had to do was, the biggest enemy that we had to clear up was a zombie dragon, which was a team effort, but we were able to clear one of them up. I went the right side because I only had enough treasure keys for one side. Now, once we sort of cleared up the middle area of the map, we move over to the boss room, and the boss room is actually terrifying. Like, this was scary. I did not know what the fuck to do. It was a lot of me resetting, a lot of me trying different strategies. Now, the reason this area was such a big pain in the ass to me was because there were 4 Gorgons, 2 had Shadow Shot, and 2 had Stone. Now, Shadow Shot is essentially like a bolting or a purge. And Stone literally does what it says, it stones you. And if you're stoned and you get attacked again, you're pretty much fucked. Guaranteed. So what I have to do is skirt around Leon, try not to get anywhere near Leon's range, deal with all of the reinforcements from either side from the monsters. It's pretty much at this point, I whip out all of my legendary tomes, legendary items, and start using them pretty much as freely as I can. I did have to reset against these guys a lot because Lara Shell died, Tethys died, you name it. A lot of people died. It took 2 hours for me to do this. It was pretty bad. And that's not even the worst of it. Once we clear out the enemies, we get to Leon. Leon, oh god. Leon was the hardest challenge by far in this entire run. Well, kind of. So, Leon has a extremely powerful attack. His Naglfar tome does a metric shit ton damage. It does like 50 plus damage. So my strategy for this boss fight was, first I used the angelic robe that I got and used on Sayla. Next I had a barrier staff that I used on Sayla. And with that, Naglfar did 33 damage to Sayla, and Sayla had 37 HP. So there were reinforcements that were spawning in return. I used my other units to take care of them. I would heal with La Rochelle, dance for La Rochelle, and heal again to make sure that our boy Sayla was at max HP every time. Sayla with Excalibur, the S rank tome, did 6 damage times 2 each turn, so 12 damage. And Leon has over 72 HP, so it's gonna take a while. It does have a 15% chance to crit, and we did manage to crit once, so it's just playing out the slow game. You gotta be patient with that. We're able to thankfully clear him out, and we move on to the final boss fight for Mortis. Now, for those of you who know anything about my channel, is I've actually done a run of FE8 before. It was a randomizer run that I live streamed, and for Mortis was actually where my challenge ended. And I was darned if I was gonna let that happen again. The problem with that though is for Mortis pretty much one-shot every single party member except for Garrick and Dulzla and Dwessel, I believe. Just those three, because they had enough HP. This is a tragic chapter. But you know that squad that we've been working with this entire time? Yeah, they all fucking die. They just all fucking die. At the end of it, deadass, we are only left with the 2 units we need to pass the chapter. Ephraim and Erica. Erica gets the last hit and destroys for Mortis with her legendary weapon. And we beat the game with only 2 guys alive. Rest in peace, you fallen soldiers. So this run sort of went as I expected, right? I knew it was going to be pretty easy early game. I knew Seth was disgusting. I didn't think it was this disgusting. I didn't realize it was this broken. It also gave me a new appreciation for certain characters like Garrick, Innes, and Sayla, who normally I wouldn't use too much because I'd be more focused on the trainees and I'd be more focused on those early game units like Natasha, Archer, more. It just gave me a bigger appreciation for all of these other units. And I think that's the biggest thing I got out of this challenge. Would I do this again? Oh, 100%. I'm just scared because this was a relatively easy run. If I did like, Hector hard mode, 0% growth run. Don't expect me to do that, by the way, guys. I'm not going to do that unless I'm... All in all, I had a really fun time doing this challenge. And it was a nice juxtaposition between thinking about strategy and just having a nice easy game. I did forget to mention that I did normal because I was like, alright, I don't want to drive myself insane because that would just not be fun for me or you guys. I want to be able to do challenges that are either completely absurd or in the middle. Not ones that are like beatable but hard. Like for example, my last run, we all know how that went. That was almost impossible. So I wanted to do one where it was like, it gave me a little bit of a challenge, but nothing too terrible. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching this. I know I sort of went on the end, but thank you for sticking around. And guys, thank you so much. If you're sticking around right now, thank you so much for watching my last video. I really appreciate the support on the last video. But anyway, I have been Meteor Kaiser, and I'll see you on the next one. Until then, as always, peace.